let's begin the Professor Chomsky's special lecture, the invited lecture. So before opening the invited lecture by Professor Chomsky, let me first give one important announcement, which is if our Zoom system gets down on our side, not on your side, please stay connected. Don't sign out, please. Our technical staff will reboot the webinar system. Okay, then you will be automatically come back.
Okay.
So now you are connected to the invited lecture by Professor Chomsky, University of Arizona and MIT. I'm coordinator Masayuki Oishi, Tohoku Gakuin University, Sendai, Japan. And, Professor Chomsky is connecting from his study in Tucson, Arizona. Okay, and we have three discussants. Could you, three of you, identify yourself with the name and affiliation? First, Sandy Wei, please.
Hi, I'm Sandy Wei Fong. I'm at the University of Arizona. I'm in linguistics and computer science.
Okay, Hisa.
I'm Hisatsugu Kitahara from Keio University, and I'm very happy to be here.
And my name is Takashi Toyoshima, also from Tohoku Gakuin University. And thank you for all joining. And I'm kind of surprised with how many attendees are hanging. And I hope my machine will hold and not disrupted in the connection. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now the structure of this lecture, the body of the master's lecture will consist of two portions, part 1 and part 2, intervened by an intermission, okay? And the part 2 and the discussion period will be intervened by a short break, okay? And please remember, all of you, more than 600 now, we have 600 registrants or participants, and they would be undoubtedly more interested in Professor Chomsky's lecture on his view of our field rather than a discussion, whatever it is. So in discussion period, it's likely to be trimmed or deleted, but you don't have to get disappointed. So this is a kind of agreement on our side. So actually, we have asked Professor Chomsky to use and speak for 2 hours. Okay, so Professor Chomsky is going to give a lecture, and its title is Minimalism, Where We Are Now and Where We Are Going. So without further ado, please join me welcoming Professor Noam Chomsky.
Thank you. My wife, Valeria, and I were looking forward very much to being with you in person. It's a disappointment that fate has decided otherwise. I hope there will be a real opportunity before too long. I've always found it useful, even in the most advanced work, to try to think things through from the beginning. New things turn up that I hadn't thought about before. I do want to turn to ongoing work, but I'd like to begin with some general remarks about the generative enterprise that began to develop in the mid-20th century. From infancy, children are trying to make some sense out of the puzzling world around them. And a similar quest is a constant theme of cultural history. in all societies we know of. In the modern world, there have been some periods where willingness to be puzzled about the world became the true spirit of the age. These are sometimes called scientific revolutions. One such period was the 17th century. The philosopher and historian of science, Alfred North Whitehead, was hardly exaggerating when he wrote that ever since our, quoting him, our intellectual life has been living upon the accumulated capital of ideas provided by the genius of the 17th century. The great breakthrough was that Galileo and others allowed themselves to be puzzled by what was just taken for granted in the prevailing neo-scholastic science. Rocks fall to the ground, steam rises to the air because they're moving to the natural place. We perceive some image as a triangle because its form goes through the air and implants itself in our brain, and so on. The new scientists recognized that these were not explanations. Rather, they were empty verbiage invoking what were called occult ideas, evading the issues. Furthermore, on critical examination, much that was taken for granted as obvious turned out to be false. For example, that a large ball of lead falls faster than a small one, disproven by Galileo with ingenious thought experiments. Language did not escape their attention. Galileo and his contemporaries expressed their awe and wonder about a truly amazing fact. With a few symbols, each of us can construct infinitely many thoughts in our minds, and we can convey to others the innermost workings of our minds. This insight poses what we may call the Galilean challenge. How is this remarkable achievement possible? The challenge seems to me to capture lucidly the major task faced by inquiry into the nature of language, in fact, into the unique nature of the human species. The uniqueness of this property of the human mind is another amazing and puzzling fact. The grand old man of American biology, Ernst Mayr, reminded us that there have been about 50 billion species since life emerged on Earth almost 50 years ago, 50 billion years ago, 54 billion years ago, sorry. But in his words, only one of these 50 billion species achieved the kind of intelligence needed to establish a civilization. This is part of his argument that we may really be alone in the universe. Extraterrestrial intelligence may not exist. That might be the solution to what's called Fermi's paradox. With so many planets like ours in the universe, how can it be that with the most assiduous search, we never find any signs of higher intelligence? Maybe it's just not there. Actually, Mayr understates the puzzle. Far short of establishing a civilization, none of the other 50 billion species can even form a thought, at least any thought that can be formulated in a symbolic system. And this one exceptional creature, Homo sapiens, is a very recent arrival on Earth, about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, which is an instant in evolutionary time. For the previous almost 4 billion years, there were no thoughts on Earth, maybe in the universe. The capacity for language and thought appears to be a true species property. It's common to all humans, has no significant analog in other species. Our closest relatives, otherwise intelligent apes, cannot begin to grasp the most elementary rudiments of language, even with the most intensive training. They have about the same auditory system as humans, but what the human infant masters reflexively and rapidly from birth is completely inaccessible to our primate relatives who hear just noise. Shortly after Galileo, the challenge was formulated more explicitly by the logicians, linguists of the Port-Royal Monastery. Their work initiated a rich tradition of what was called general and rational grammar. General because it sought the universal principles of language, rational because it sought to go beyond description to explanation. The language was understood to be an instrument of thought. One leading figure, Wilhelm von Humboldt, identified language with thought. He also formulated a basic feature of the Galilean challenge, the fact that language makes infinite use of finite means, which is another puzzle. Actually, Humboldt's formulation of the puzzle brings to light a serious omission in the tradition. It failed to accommodate Aristotle's crucial distinction between possession of knowledge and use of knowledge, in contemporary terms, between competence and performance. Humboldt, like the Galilean challenge and the tradition generally, kept to use of knowledge. In fact, use of knowledge in production. Very little was said about perception of language, which happens to be a prime concern of modern psycholinguistics. Both production and perception access the knowledge that is possessed. They make use of it along with other cognitive processes. But the core task is to discover the system of knowledge possessed, the internal language, called I language in technical usage. It seems that the Aristotelian insight lay dormant until it was clarified in the modern theory of computation, and adopted in the generative enterprise. There seems to be no sign of it in the intervening 2,500 years. The study of general and rational grammar languished, and it was forgotten. In the 20th century, it was swept aside by anthropological and structural linguistics. These had major achievements. For the first time, a sharp distinction was made between historical and synchronic linguistics. So, de Saussure's main contribution. Careful procedures of analysis were established to determine the elements of language and their arrangements, sharpening many descriptive concepts. By mid-20th century, a largely shared consensus had been reached within what was then a small community of professional linguists. As they themselves described the consensus, it rested on two pillars: one, procedures of analysis, and two, a conception of the nature and acquisition of language. The procedures produced what they called a taxonomic science, an account of elements and arrangements of each individual language. Languages, it was assumed, could vary with almost no limits. The general conception, the second facet of this consensus, adhered very largely to Leonard Bloomfield's description of language as a matter of training and habits. A language is a system of habit. It's acquired by training and general principles of habit formation. It's constantly changing with every new experience. If there's anything novel, it would result from analogy. The philosophy of language adopted very much the same view. The most prominent figure, W.V.O. Quine, defined a language as a complex of dispositions to verbal behavior established by conditioning, changing constantly. The generative enterprise began with skepticism about such assumptions. Invocation of habit and analogy is wholly at odds with simple observations about language. The concepts are actually much like the occult ideas of the 16th century neo-scholastics. Furthermore, why should linguistics, alone among the sciences, content itself with taxonomy instead of seeking explanations? Discontent with the consensus gained force thanks to new intellectual tools provided by the recently developed theory of computation. These tools made it possible to resurrect Aristotle's forgotten distinction between possession and use of knowledge. They also made it very clear how a finite mechanism can have infinite output that does not resolve Humboldt's puzzle about production, but it does carve out the domain of feasible inquiry, the study of the language, the knowledge possessed, which has finite means and infinite scope. Production, like other creative action, is beyond reach in any fundamental sense, as is even simple voluntary action. Most important, these new tools provided the means for developing explanatory theories of language that provide a recursive specification of a denumerable set of sentences, assigning them their correct structure. It's quoting the words of the first attempt 70 years ago to develop what later came to be called generative grammars. As soon as the generative enterprise was undertaken, problems arose. The taxonomic consensus had no real puzzles. Everything was known. The procedures of analysis could be applied to any corpus of materials. But as soon as the search for explanation began, it turned out that almost nothing was known. Every sentence posed new puzzles. Worse still, the elements that were postulated in the simplest theories, the ones with the most far-reaching explanations, could not possibly be found by a schedule of procedures, just as in every other branch of science. There was at once an irreconcilable contradiction between the structuralist taxonomic science and the search for explanation. Another tension arose. Explanation has to proceed at two levels. A generative grammar is a theory that seeks to explain the properties of the I language possessed by an individual language user. At a deeper level, the theory of the language faculty, UG in modern terms, is concerned with the innate factors that make language acquisition possible, factors that distinguish humans from all other organisms. But UG has goals that appear contradictory. UG must meet three conditions. First, it must be rich enough so that it can overcome the general problem called poverty of stimulus, the fact that what is acquired demonstrably lies far beyond the evidence available. Second, it must be simple enough so that it could have evolved. Third, it must be the same for all possible languages. We achieve a genuine explanation of some linguistic phenomenon only if it keeps to mechanisms that satisfy the joint conditions of learnability, evolvability, and universality, which appear to be at odds. The course of theoretical inquiry for the past 70 years has been driven by the goal of reconciling these conflicting requirements. These problems were evident at the outset of the generative enterprise. We now know that the problems are considerably more severe than what was assumed. Start with evolvability. Recent genetic studies have shown that humans began to separate not long after humans appeared. There are no known differences in language faculty. And furthermore, there is no meaningful evidence of symbolic behavior prior to emergence of modern humans, Homo sapiens. These facts indicate that language emerged pretty much along with modern humans, which is an instant in evolutionary time. The same facts suggest that the basic structure of language should be quite simple, the result of some small rewiring of the brain that took place once and has not changed in the brief period since. The apparent contradiction with learnability therefore becomes sharper. The research on language acquisition has extended the paradox further. Experiments have shown that a child of 2 or 3 years old has largely mastered basic properties of its language, including some remarkable ones. That seems to indicate that UG must be very rich, while the condition of evolvability demands that it be very simple. And the problem of apparently endless variation hovers in the background. Well, in the past few years, some hope has emerged to resolve this tangle of dilemmas within the so-called minimalist program. Let's begin with a simple but crucial example, while remembering that modern science began with the willingness to be puzzled by very simple things, like a ball dropping to earth and at a rate independent of mass, contrary to everyone's belief. So consider the sentence number 1, which I will try to put here if I can. Now, why can't I? Can you come here? I need my technical assistant to try to get this. Why isn't it showing? Ah, okay. Thanks. Now I have to turn it on? Why isn't it on? No, it's the wrong one. Oh, God.
Let's see.
You have to do this. No,
What did you do here?
nothing. I tried to do this.
What?
Get MXP2, but it's not coming.
Ask if they can hear you.
Hmm?
Can you hear us?
No, they can't.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you, but no screen. Oh,
Oh,
it,
there you are.
come back.
Here it goes.
Okay, now it's on. So that was the example I had in mind. The boy and the girl are in the room, but not is in the room. Simple point, but notice that there's a puzzle. To determine agreement, the child surely does not use the simplest computational rule, the rule of adjacency, surely part of the child's cognitive repertoire. Instead, the child reflexively relies on something it never hears, the structure that its mind creates. The child then assigns plurality by virtue of the nature of this abstract structure. Stranger still, this property called structure dependence holds for all constructions in all languages. I'll take just one more example to illustrate. Just consider these 4 sentences. First one, the mechanic fixed the car carefully. Second, the mechanic carefully packed his tools. Third, putting them together, the mechanic who fixed the car carefully packed his tools. Fourth, putting the word carefully in front, carefully, the mechanic who fixed the car packed his tools. The third sentence, C, this one, if I can point to it, is ambiguous. It can be understood as either in A or as in B. It means that the sentence D, on the other hand, this one, is unambiguous. It simply means that he carefully packed his tools. The adverb carefully seeks a verb, but it cannot use the simplest computation. Pick the linearly closest verb. Like adjacency, this operation is certainly within the child's cognitive repertoire. The child has no problem picking the first bead on a string, on a string. Nevertheless, UG forces the child to ignore it and to select the more remote verb, which happens to be the structurally closest one, as we see if we assign the structure in what our mind tells us is the shortest way. There is, and it's important to recognize that what's significant about this is not simply that it's using invisible hierarchic structure. What's crucially important is that it is not using, the child and we are not using the simplest computation. The child is ignoring 100% of what it hears, reflexively using structures it never hears, but that its mind constructs. This universal property of structure dependence is, of course, unlearnable. So it must be that linear order is simply not available to the system that constructs thoughts. Let me see if I can bring myself back here. Could you stay here?
You want to go back?
Okay. Here I am. So the universal property of structure dependence is obviously not learnable. It therefore must be that linear order is not available to the system that constructs thoughts. That actually makes sense. So take Japanese and English. They are virtual mirror images of each other in basic order, but there's no difference in the thought expressed between subject-verb-object and subject-object-verb structures. Now that seems to be true quite generally for the basic propositional structure of thoughts. Why then does speech require linearization? The reason is quite obvious. The articulatory system cannot produce structures. It'll be a while. So the externalization process must impose linear order on an internal system of generation of thought, which is unordered. Actually, sign language is less strictly ordered because the options available in visual space are greater. But these sensory motor systems used for externalization have nothing at all to do with language. They were in place long before language emerged. They have not changed since. True language is the internal system that generates thoughts. These observations reinforce the traditional view that language is essentially a system of thought. The modern doctrine that language is basically a system of communication may have even evolved from animal communication. That seems quite untenable. The next problem is to determine why language keeps to structure dependence, ignoring the simple properties of linear order. Well, learning is excluded, must come from innate structure. And then turning to the problems of explanation and evolution, which are closely linked. The simpler the innate structure, the deeper the explanation, and the more feasible the problem of evolvability. So let's suppose then that Mother Nature picked the simplest possible solution to the task at hand, providing a language faculty that allows the generation of a discrete infinity of each of structured expressions, each the linguistic formulation of a thought. That's the task, and let's assume that Mother Nature was smart enough to pick the simplest solution, the solution that's embedded in some form in all others. That is an operation that takes two objects already generated, forms a new one without modifying either and without adding any new structure, simply binary set formation called merge in contemporary discussion. If the internal language is based on merge, then linear order is simply not available, and structure dependence is the only option for language. Note that we now have a genuine explanation for a fundamental property of language, one with very rich consequences. There's no learning, so the problem of learnability is overcome. As for evolvability, if language is to exist at all, it must include this postulated operation, so there's no problem of evolvability. To be precise, there's a problem for biology. How did it happen? But this is as far as the study of language and mind can take us. Along the same lines, there are genuine explanations for other strange properties of language. One is the ubiquitous property of displacement. Phrases are heard in one position, but interpreted both there and in some unpronounced gap. Now, that was always thought by me too to be a curious imperfection of language. In fact, it turns out to be the result of the simplest subcase of merge, what's called internal merge. The case of merge with least search for the objects to be merged. Also automatic is the operation of reconstruction of the full sense of the displaced element and its deletion, which would otherwise be a very complex operation. There's ample literature on all these matters, so I'll put them aside. And note that these are the first genuine explanations in the long and rich history of the study of language and mind. That's not a small matter, I think, though it's insufficiently appreciated. We also have an opening to solution of the third of the trio of vexing and apparently contradictory demands on UG. That is the great variety of languages, which appears to be incompatible with the other two conditions on UG. Thus, we now have a sharp distinction between internal language based on merge, yielding linguistic formulation of thought on the one hand, and externalization to a sensory motor medium on the other. Externalization connects two entirely unrelated systems. An operation that can be carried out in many ways and is likely to be complex and unstable. It's a very natural candidate for the properties of variation, complexity, and mutability, which would then not be properties of language, but properties of an amalgam of language and unrelated organic systems. Ideally, it might turn out that the internal language is fixed and invariant, close to it. That would be the optimal solution to the problem of generation of an infinite number of thoughts. That, of course, is a distant goal, but work is tending in that direction. What seemed inconceivable only a few years ago now seems, to me at least, an objective that can be seriously contemplated and pursued. It's the objective that has been called the strong minimalist thesis. More precisely, the strong minimalist thesis holds that I-language, the system that generates thought, keeps to merge and language independent principles, such as computational efficiency. Optimally, any departure from the strong minimalist thesis should be so slight as to be susceptible to a simple account of its origins. That is, of course, a very stern demand, but it's one that's a valuable guideline for inquiry, has been quite productive, may even be attainable. Well, the next task is to try to extend the domain of genuine explanation. I'll turn to that in a moment, but first we have to make clear that we understand the computational operation on which explanation is based. On inspection, merge proves to be defective in a way that has been familiar since the origins of the generative enterprise. At the outset, 70 years ago, the immediate task was to develop operations that are rich enough to permit at least description of what was coming to light as taxonomy was abandoned in favor of the search for explanation with generative grammars. It was understood that the devices proposed were far too rich and had to be sharpened and narrowed, and that there were hidden assumptions that had to be overcome. typical case was phrase structure grammar. It allowed impossible rules, constantly used illegitimate symbols, concealing what had to be explained. So there was no barrier in phrase structure grammar against such rules as VP, arrow, P, AP. No barrier, and in fact, an apparently legitimate rule, such as VP, arrow, V, NP, is actually no different from X, arrow, Y, Z. The difference is a hidden assumption. For such reasons, phrase structure grammar was abandoned 50 years ago in favor of X-bar theory, which overcame these flaws while bringing other ones to the fore, as later discovered. Well, similar issues arise with merge. Too many options are allowed, and there are hidden assumptions. Notice that merge was defined in a way that diverges from standard recursion. So consider, for example, the rules of formation for a formal system, say propositional calculus, having the usual operations, not, and or. Suppose we've used these rules to derive P, and then to derive not P. P is still available, so we can access it and use it to form the new formula P or not P. We can now define the workspace as the set of objects that are available for further computation. In effect, the workspace specifies the current state of the computation. For formal systems, the workspace includes everything so far generated. That's standard recursion. That's the reason why the notion was never defined. A hidden assumption in the formulation of merge, and an important one, is that departs from standard recursion. So suppose the workspace contains A and B. Under standard recursion with the operation O, we could form O of AB, call it X. That would add the new element X to the workspace along with A and B. That's standard recursion, as in rules of formation for a formal system. But merge was defined initially so that A and B disappear when the set AB is added to the workspace. So formulations of merge therefore added a hidden operation, remove, but that's unsatisfactory. Why should language require this strange departure from the strong minimalist thesis and from standard recursion? Turns out that there are strong empirical reasons for language to observe this special condition. Suppose it's violated. Suppose that merge of P and Q yields the new workspace containing both P and Q, both the set PQ and P and Q, as in normal recursion. Well, further operations can convert P to some new thing, which can be arbitrarily complex. And then the freestanding Q, which was left behind, can be merged to this new thing, violating no conditions. The result is exactly as if the occurrence of Q within the new thing developed had internally merged to P, to P prime, the new one, violating every condition on movement. It's as if the object of an unaccusative verb were allowed to move in one step over structures of arbitrary complexity, violating every imaginable condition. Well, that can't be allowed, so this departure from standard recursion is necessary. We do not, however, want to add a new operation, remove. Rather, this consequence should follow from the simplest formulation of the operation. I'll call it, the way it's now used is merge in capitals. We'll still call it merge, but I'll write it as merge in capitals. There's a side comment here, incidentally. From this point on, I'm going to be discussing joint work, which is based on intensive discussions with a group that was originally formed by the late Sam Epstein. It's known in the literature as EKS. Epstein, Hisa Kitahara, and Dan Seeley. It's later joined by Rini Hoibrooks, Sandue Fong, Andrew McInerney, and Yushi Sugimoto. Well, continuing, let's notice that merge of P and Q is actually an operation on the workspace, not just of P and Q, maps it into a new workspace. Call it WS prime. Let me see if I can manage this. Okay, it's fine. So here's the new definition of merge, capital merge. Merge applies to P and Q and the workspace, and it forms a new workspace, which is a set containing the new item, the set PQ, and then a bunch of other things. Call them X1 to Xn, and there are going to be conditions that hold on this. Well, we want the conditions to be as simple as possible. One obvious condition is that nothing should be lost by the operation. So if A is a member of the workspace WS, it should still be accessible to computation in the new workspace WS prime. Second condition comes just from strong minimalist condition, is that N should be minimal. N is this. That should be minimal. Merge will always add one new element to the workspace, namely PQ, but it should have no more than one new accessible element. Well, let's take that to be the concept merge. Notice that, let me see if I can go back to where I am. Okay, see you again. Notice that an element A can be accessible to merge, even if it's not part of the workspace, but it's rather a term, as it's called, of a member of the workspace. A term of some element X is a member of X or a member of a term of X, standard recursive definition. So in the example 4, which the merge definition that I just had, P and Q are members of WS, but they are not in the new workspace, WS prime, though they do remain accessible in it. And a term of X of the workspace, the new workspace, may be inaccessible if some other condition blocks accessibility, maybe the phase impenetrability condition. If that blocks accessibility, it's not accessible to the next computation, even if it's a term of an element that is accessible. Another bar to accessibility is the very important principle of minimal search. Minimal search, if it were not for minimal search, internal merge would be blocked as a violation of resource restriction. Would add 2 elements instead of 1. Minimal search also has important empirical consequences. For example, it explains why Japanese, but not English and other languages, allow multiple spec constructions. EKS have shown that in an important paper. There's actually more to it, which I'll get to if there's time. Note also that no operation remove is needed. Its effects follow from the minimal yield condition on merge, principle of resource restriction. Resource restriction renders derivations strictly Markovian. The present stage is independent of what had been generated earlier. It's unlike standard recursion, but we get that result without adding any new operations, just by taking what can count as the simplest version of the combinatorial operation, the one that most closely meets the minimalist condition. Well, I'm not going to run through the details. There's literature on the topic, but it can be shown that merge in this sense includes the two standard cases, internal and external merge, but it bars all the extensions of merge that have been proposed in recent literature, bars parallel merge, late merge, and others. All of these run into the problem that I mentioned before of being able to generate properly impossible entities. So they're all rolled out. Now, these extensions of merge have been used effectively to provide an account for many important, very important phenomena, such phenomena as across-the-board deletion. But we have to understand these accounts not as explanations, but as useful descriptions of properties of language which are yet to be explained. Well, the next question is, why should language observe resource restriction, unlike recursion generally? A plausible answer is that language is an organic system. It's an organic system which seeks to use the least possible resources. Sandwei Fang suggests that resource restriction may derive from the fact that neural computation is slow. I'll quote him. The brain, he says, points out, is the weak link in our cognitive apparatus. Our sensory apparatus far outstrips the brain's capacity to process the high resolution input to the sensory organs. The eye responds at the single photon level, the minimal possible detection. The eardrum vibrations respond at a level smaller than the diameter of a hydrogen atom. Follows that most of what the brain does is to throw out masses of information. It's a well-known property of language acquisition as well. And if this line of thinking can be developed, it would be a rare example, actually the first example, of how language design is shaped by properties of the brain. It's an important matter to pursue. Well, distinct occurrences of an element of X may or may not be copies. So if we have the sentence, John was seen, John, produced by the internal language, the two are copies. The latter is deleted. If we say, John saw John, they're not copies. Copies are formed, it seems, by internal merge, but more generally, we can assume that copies are formed generally by merge, just a property of merge. If they're formed by external merge, they will not appear in the output because of resource restriction. No other option forms copies, Copies are deleted for reasons of computational efficiency, but only if they are in merge configurations. Operations on copies thus appear to be strictly related to merge. There are significant consequences to which I'll return. With this sharpening of basic concepts, we can now, which I want to extend in a moment, we can now turn to the project of extending the domain of explanation, seeing how closely we can approach strong minimalist thesis as we move to new matters. And I would suggest here that we take a short break and then come back to some more technical considerations. Okay. And I now want to get onto video again.
It's not.
Oh,
Okay. So shall we start again? Professor Chomsky,
are we
can you start
back in
again?
business?
Oh, yeah. Okay, let's resume the Professor Chomsky's lecture. Okay, second.
Okay. Well, I ended with giving a definition of merge that satisfies the strong minimalist thesis, different from standard definitions, which don't have to worry about the fact that it's an organic creature carrying out the activities. I also talked about copies and deletion and suggested that deletion and forming copies are both related to merge. That's about the state of current work, but I think we can actually do better. Deletion should belong just to externalization, has nothing to do with internal language. The internal language is accessed by other cognitive systems, but doesn't care about deletion. It's just dealing with what's in the internal part with no deletion, the thought expressed. So we should dissociate deletion from I language. And we should also dissociate copies from merge. There's no real reason why they should have anything to do with each other. So let's imagine the simplest possible solution. We form, in the course of a derivation, if there are two structurally identical elements, we may or may not take them to be copies. It's totally free. So if you have a sentence like, the men who read the book liked the book, could be the same book or not. The intonation will be slightly different. If it's the men who read the book, liked the book, that's the result of the deletion operation. That's an operation that's reduced copies. But thought it could be either, and that's general. So any two structurally identical items may or may not be copies. That's all we have to say. Now, what about deletion? Well, here we can turn to minimal search. Minimal search at this point can be an operation which searches everything that has been generated and marks everything it finds undeletable. That's all. Anything it finds, it says you're undeletable. So in the men who liked the book, who read the book, liked the book, the two things can be copies, but minimal search can find both of them. So therefore, they're not deletable. The only thing that minimal search can't find is something that's C-commanded by a head, the head of a chain in technical words. Can't find that. So it doesn't mark it undeletable, therefore it deletes. In fact, that alone, that means that gives you the effect of deletion simply picking the highest member, the highest, structurally highest member of internal merge, but without referring to internal merge. It's an internal merge configuration, but it just can't go below the top element. So that gives us a very simple approach to deletion and forming of copies. You can form copies anywhere you want. You get deletion if they're not marked on delete by minimal search. And that should be the end of the story. It's worth thinking about that. Well, the next step we want to make is to turn to problems that so far we haven't been able to handle at all. In fact, let's start with two major problems for which even generative grammars of arbitrary complexity have had no solution. So they're hard. Let's turn to them. There are two major ones. One is head movement. The other is unbounded, unstructured sequences. Things like John, Bill, my friends, left for a vacation. Get it, that sequence is long as you want, and it's unbounded, has no structure, ungenerable by any merge-based system. Can't get it by phrase structure rules, can't get it by transformational rules. In fact, there's no way you can get it. That's one. What about head movement? Well, that actually is a familiar operation, but it's illegitimate. It's not formulable within any version of transformational grammar. It's not formulable with any merge-based system. It's not formulable by any other system without some artifice. Also, unlike A and A bar movement, head movement typically has no semantic consequences. A and A bar movement always do. So interpretation is the same, whether, say, a verb raises to inflection as in French or stays in situ as in English, understood the same way. Well, that fact has led to the suggestion that the rule is actually part of externalization. But that runs foul of the fact that it seems to be cyclic. So it can't be part of externalization. It involves this internal to the syntax. Seems to be a apparent contradiction. So here we have two unformulable notions. There's no way to handle them within generative grammar altogether. So let's start with that hard problem, see if we can handle that. What would be the minimal assumptions needed to incorporate both of these unformulable matters within the domain of explanatory theory? Again, I'll now be discussing ongoing work among the working group I mentioned before, and I'll only be able to keep to a general outline. I'll omit many details and skirt some outstanding problems. So let's begin with sequences. We can assume fairly generally that wherever there is an XP, there will be a sequence of every time we see a single XP, like in John So Bill, it's basically the limiting case of a sequence. Now, let me see if I can go back to this. Valeria? Valeria? Can you be here? Why did
No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Start the video.
The camera switch doesn't work well.
Can you?
Oh,
we've
I
got-
see. We'll all see.
Okay.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, we do.
Okay. I think I'm just going to stay on the, I'll just talk without you seeing me. So I'll stay on this screen because there's a lot of examples. Okay. So let's
Sure.
continue like that. So again, wherever you see a simple sentence like John ran, you can assume that it's the limiting case of sequences like what you see there. John, Bill, my friends, etc., ran, danced, took a vacation, etc. So the cases we always deal with are just limiting cases of sequences. Okay, let's keep that in mind. Now, the order of this, when we have an actual sequence, the order is crucial. You can see that by adding a word like respectively or other such linguistic devices as in that order and so on. The sequence is associated with a coordinator. For simplicity, let's just keep to conjunction, okay? So we have an operation, call it form sequence, which creates something like number 7 there. Optionally, you can have a coordinator and then as many things as you need with no further structure. You pick n members out of the workspace and form an object like that. Now the coordinator, as indicated there, is optional. If it's present, externalization gets it to show up in one place or another, typically before the xn. If it's missing, the form sequence operation produces sequences that are rather like lists. That's a contrast between these two. So one of them, the second one, B, has a coordinator, the first one doesn't. John lives near the border next to a farm with his family. That's basically a list. The second one is different, B. John lives to the border next to a farm and with his family, and they behave quite differently. The true coordination, namely B, does impose a different prosody, but it also imposes rigid structures. So elements can raise from A, but not from B. So somewhat awkward, but you can say, which farm does John live near? Which farm does John live near the border next to with his family? It's impossible in B. You can't say which farm does John live in the live in. I changed it near the border, next to and with his family. That one's out. So the first one's awkward, but far more acceptable than B. B violates what's called the coordinate structure constraint. A doesn't. It's not a coordinate structure. Well, the constraint actually is eliminable. There are strict matching conditions on coordinations. And as Rini Hoibergs pointed out, you can assume that the coordinate structure constraint is just a special case of these. If you pull out of one element, you got to pull out of all of them. Otherwise, the matching condition is missed. So we can eliminate the coordinate structure constraint. We notice that we have two kinds of sequences. Well, let's move on. There is an interpretive, actually the matching condition, I should say, involves pretty interesting semantic properties. So they're actually reminiscent of what in classical rhetoric is called zeugma. So take examples like 9. John arrived early, met Bill, and got a good seat. Take B. To arrive early, meet Bill, and get a good seat seems to be what John wants, not seem to be. Arriving early, meeting Bill, and getting a good seat seems, but not seem, to be what John wants. Now take this. To arrive early, to meet Bill, and to get a good seat seems or seem to be what John wants. The four are different. Let's that's 9. Where's 8? I missed 8. Well, one of them is missing in my handout. I'll just have to read it. Take these cases. John arrived at the hospital in an ambulance and in a coma. That's okay. John arrived at the hospital in an ambulance and a coma. That's out. There we're coordinating the NP. In the first one, we coordinated the PP. Again, John arrived at the hospital in an ambulance and in a coma. Okay. John arrived at the hospital in an ambulance and a coma. That's out. How about John arrived at the hospital in an ambulance and his street clothes? That one's okay again. So enough to show that there are properties to look at, serious properties about when and where coordination is possible. Notice that the interpretive system that turns all of the derivation over to other cognitive systems, it imposes a much stricter matching condition on the paired NPs than on the paired PPs. So in an ambulance in a coma is no good. In an ambulance and in a coma is okay. The PP coordination can be interpreted as two independent events. In an ambulance is one event, in a coma is another event, or they could be the same event. But the NP coordination is a single compound event. So he arrived in an ambulance in a coma. An ambulance in a coma is one event. There's a distinction between the compound events and the independent events, and that was the example that I showed before. John arrived early, met Bill, and got a good seat can be independent events. To arrive early, meet Bill, and get a good seat is a single event. Okay, that's why it seems, not seem. Arriving early, meeting Bill, and getting a good seat is one event, seems. The last one, to arrive early, to meet Bill, and to get a good seat, can be interpreted either way. Can either be seems to be what John wants or seem to be what John wants. And that's quite definite, quite general. So there's two kinds of events we have to distinguish clearly, independent ones and single ones. Now, actually, the form sequence operation does differentiate these. We'll get to this in a moment. The form sequence operation does differentiate these by picking different units to form a sequence. When it picks a noun phrase unit, it's going to be a compound event. When it picks a PP unit, could be either compound or independent. Same with those other examples under 9 that I just showed. Well, we know that's a background to what we have to solve. So let's turn to see how these forms are generated with the right interpretations in accord with a strong minimalist thesis. So let's start with one of the more complex cases, which pairs an unaccusative and a transitive, something like John arrived and met Bill. Okay, well, just keeping to the essentials, the underlying structure is going to be this thing here. It'll be, there's a, let's see if I've got my, this is the complementizer, subject, inflection, then comes the sequence. The sequence is this thing up to the end of the, up to this, that's the sequence. And within the sequence, there are two parallel things generated separately. One of them is arrive John, the other is John meet Bill, okay? The V's are the, I'm adopting here the Barrère-Marantz root categorizer analysis, so that arrive and meet are both roots, and they're interpreted as verbal because the categorizer is V. Actually, the V star distinction, which creates the, which may or may not create a phase, that's eliminable. We can determine, it's actually determined by the lexical content of the roots. So we don't really have any need to postulate different categorizers. Depending on the lexical content, it will be V or V star. And if it's V star, it's a phase. Okay. Well, here's the way it works. The derivation first creates the objects that are marked with the braces with the subscript 2. First creates these two things in parallel up to here, okay, in the normal fashion. Just both form form V arrive John, you form John V star meet Bill, normal way. First step. Notice that they satisfy theta theory. Now, either John number 1 or John number 2, either of them can raise by internal merge to the position of John 3. Either this one or this one can merge, okay? The one that does not merge can be freely taken to be a copy of John 1, because we're allowed to take copies freely and they're structurally identical. We're still assuming to be derivations to be strictly Markovian, no memory. That means the interpretive system doesn't know which one raised, can't look back and see. This is not standard recursion. It's Markovian recursion, restricted. All that the interpretive system sees is two possible internal merge structures. Now, for the reasons I mentioned before, both the operation that's saying, the minimal search operation that's saying don't delete, can find John 3, it can't find John 1 and John 2 because of minimal search. So John 1 and John 2 will both delete. That yields the number, that yields the example up above, John arrived and met Bill. So we get it automatically, no problems. Notice that across the board deletion falls out as a special case. Nothing to say about it. So we can generate what, John bought what, and Bill handed what to Tom, just generate them. One or the other can raise, one of the other whats, 2 or 3, can raise to the position 1. Whichever one doesn't raise can be taken to be a copy. The interpretive system has no idea which one raised, but both configurations in both configurations, what number 1 is the only thing that can be found by minimal search. So what number, and therefore marked on delete. So therefore what 2 and what 3 delete. And we get across the board deletion. Well, go back to number 10 again. In John arrived and met Bill, the 2 conjuncts share tense, but that's not necessary. So exactly the same analysis will apply to John arrives every day at noon and met Bill yesterday. Also applies with distinct aspectual and modal structures, which I'm not considering here. Well, it follows from this that tense is a feature of small v, not of inful. If I have that here, yeah. Tense is a feature of small v because it can vary in the 2 cases. It's not a feature of inful. This thing is not t. It's phi features, but not t. Phi features have to be the same, but tense doesn't. So contrary to what's always been assumed, tense is not a property of the inflectional object, which is why I went back to the notation inful instead of t. Well, there's a good deal. This account could be extended to raising of v to c, but that seems to me a rather questionable move. That step, raising of v to c, may fall under a different category, under the v second phenomenon. It's a very different kind of object. It's pretty much restricted to roots or else embedded structures that are interpreted as roots. And furthermore, more complex elements than a head can raise, as in sentences like, what have been the main reactions to these revelations? My feeling is all these phenomena should be put aside from further inquiry. Well, there's a good deal more to say about all these topics, but that seems to me the essence of the matter. And if so, the phenomena fall within the, first of all, we have an answer to them for the first time. And secondly, they fall within the domain of explanatory theory with one minimal departure from the strong minimalist thesis, namely the operation form sequence, which is unavoidable given the empirical facts, just the fact that you have unbounded sequences. A lot of open questions arise. One of them, which is an interesting one, is the problem of recasting all previous analyses as being the limiting cases of sequences. Another problem is exploring the effects of different coordinators, there are several, and of sequences within sequences, which you can have, and very intricate questions involving interpretation. How intricate is illustrated by a monumental study of the simple case of conjunction by Barry Shine. Longest book I know with the shortest title, 600 pages, called And. That's the simplest cases. Doesn't involve the ones I just mentioned. Well, notice that this account so far made no mention of head movement. In fact, it provides a way to eliminate that unformable operation. So externalization is going to require an operation that amalgamates the inflectional elements. That is, and that, sorry, not V and the roots. Inflection, V and the roots. They have to be amalgamated. How it's done is a question of morphology, which varies among languages to some extent, has further effects as part of externalization, but none of it is involved in going to the interpretive system, which hands things over to other cognitive systems. That just looks at 11, doesn't care about how it's amalgamated. Well, notice that there's a hidden assumption here that requires attention. It's actually a lingering assumption from earlier work and one that's been unanswered. The interpretive system applies at the phase level, like everything else except merge. So how can it determine that in the simple case, 11, say, how can it determine that subject John 3 was raised at an earlier stage of the derivation? The interpretive system applies at the level C, that's the phase. So how can it look back and say John 3 was raised from John 2 or from John 1? How can it say it was raised at all? It doesn't know. Because it can't look back to see how the derivation worked. Notice that consideration works for all cases of raising, even the simplest ones. Let's go back to this for simplicity. If, in this case, number 14, if, sorry, so I can get this in the right place. If here, this is the general case. It has the structure indicated there. The bracket 3 is a phase, has to be labeled and sent off to interpretation. I'll assume here that it's labeled by small v. There's actually good reasons for that, which I'll put aside and has interesting consequences, but no time for it. So let's say it's labeled by small v, goes off to interpretation, has no problems. There's a problem of the case of external argument 2. How does it get case? We've been assuming that it's a reflex of agreement, therefore the inflectional element, but that hasn't yet been introduced at the level 3. It's a problem with the labeling algorithm that's been assumed in prior work. Let me put that aside for now. I'll come back to it. The long-standing problem is that internal merge takes place internally to the phase marked 1. So at the phase level, namely 1, the interpretive system does not have the information that internal merge has applied. This actually seems to be the only case where memory is needed for interpretation beyond what's available at the phase level in order to see that internal merge is applied, forming the chain with the external arguments, EA1, EA2. There are some tricky ways around it, but suppose we adopt the minimalist perspective and ask how far we can proceed with no assumptions, okay? So let's assume that the interpretive system is as simple as possible. It lacks the computational capacities to find out that internal merge has applied in the derivation it interprets. Like other operations, the interpretive operation is strictly Markovian. It simply inspects the symbolic objects that are presented at the stage of the derivation where it applies. So accordingly, inspecting number 14, int, the interpretation operation, sees only 2 unrelated inscriptions, EA1 and EA2. It does see that EA2 VP, that unit, this one, is labeled V, can see that, and that the theta structure is in order. So it can carry out its operations without problem. Their only problem is that the 2 EAs, say in John saw Bill, the 2 EAs are unrelated, the raised one and the lower one. However, as we've seen, there's a way to establish the relation. the interpretive operator, or in fact, we can just freely take the two to be copies, as we can do all the time. Any two items can be taken to be copies as long as they're structurally identical. Well, the minimal search operation for deletion in the externalization system is going to find EA1 and say you're undeletable, but it can't find EA2 thanks to minimal search. So EA2 is going to delete in the normal way. Well, what about EA1? It lacks a theta role, and every relevant noun phrase ought to have a theta role, but it does have a semantic role. In fact, it has the most venerable semantic role of all of them. It's the argument of a predication. John saw Bill, John saw Bill is predicated of John. And that has interpretive effects. We see them in such cases as to seem to be intelligent is hard, where the subject of the raising verb seem does have a separate interpretation, semi-agentive. There are also other cases. The semantic, the very interesting facts about the existential presuppositions of subject position. The existential presuppositions of subject position are known to be much stronger than in what are called existential constructions. So you can say, there's a fly in the bottle, there's a flaw in the proof. A fly is, you can say a fly is in the bottle, but you can't say a flaw is in the proof. The argument, that would have an existential presupposition that's lacking in the so-called existential construction. So that's a semantic role of the surface subject. The argument role, this argument role of EA1, the surface subject, can be taken to legitimize it. And more generally, we can revise the theta criterion to the condition that each occurrence of a nominal phrase either have a theta role or an argument role. And that can be the expanded theta criterion. Well, the next task is to extend the analysis to raising to object, which ought to come out the same as raising to subject. And in fact, the raised object does have a semantic role. So take 15a and 15b. John believes someone in the group to be a police infiltrator. That's with ordinary extensional ECM, exceptional case marking raising. And A means that there's somebody in the group, maybe Bill, whom John believes to be a police infiltrator. B and C just mean that John believes that somebody or other in the group, he doesn't know who, is a police infiltrator. Same is true of existential import. It holds for the raised object, A, but just as it raises, it does in the structurally analogous position of subject. John believed, it's the same way in the object case. John believed a fly to be in the bottle, but not John believed a flaw to be in the proof. So the argument roles of subjective predication and what's called de re interpretation are similar, same thing. You get a de re interpretation in the raising case, not in a non-raising case. We now have a strong version of duality of semantics. External merge is one-to-one associated with theta role. Internal merge is one-to-one associated with argument position. Merge also always yields a theta or argument role, a semantic role in the now general sense. Well, we still have a little time. We can move on to this same approach. Provides a way to eliminate control theory altogether. It incorporates an important insight of Norbert Hornstein's. Consider cases like number 16 there. John tried to win. Hornstein points out that the John-X relation, which has been considered pro, is basically the same as the NP trace relation. In our present terms, it's an IAM configuration, internal merge configuration, which is visible to interpretation. Hornstein properly rejects the artifice of taking X to be pro, which mimics trace. So he assumes that X raises to the position of John. Well, that eliminates pro and control theory, which is an important step forward, but it conflicts with theta theory and duality of semantics. Furthermore, it's the only case that conflicts with it, which as usual raises suspicions. There's also a technical problem. Technical problem shows up in 17. Suppose you have John saw X. John saw John. Suppose you raise John from the X position to the theta position, the position right here. Raise it from here to here. It's trace, it's going to delete, just as in 16. It's not marked by it's not marked undeletable. And the derivation is going to yield John saw, meaning that John saw John, something that could be the answer to the question, who did John see in the mirror? But you can't do that. That derivation is impossible. And now it's not blocked in Hornstein's system. It's not blocked by theta theory because it's abandoned theta theory. But we're now in a position to have the best of both worlds, assuming nothing new, no violation of theta theory, no such problems as 17. So go back to 15 if we can find it. Yeah, go back to 15. And let's take John 16, I think, not 15. So go back to 16. Take John and X to be introduced into the theta positions they occupy, introduced by external merge in the standard way. If X is strictly identical to John, the two can freely be taken as copies. The lower one is going to delete in the usual way. It's not marked on delete. All conditions are satisfied. Well, now let's go back to 17 and see what's the matter with it. What blocks John saw? Actually, theta theory does. It prevents John from raising to the theta position, spec of C2 here. Can't raise here. Why? Because this provision of theta theory is that a theta signer can assign one theta role. Not, it can assign different theta roles, but they have to go to different things. Can't assign a single theta role, two theta roles to the same element. In this case, to the two copies of John. Can't assign different theta roles to the two copies of John, which are basically the same thing. So this case is no problem as long as theta theory remains intact. So we can overcome that. Suppose we have a case where X in 17 is not strictly identical to John. Something like John tried Mary to win. Well, that's the kind of, here, this one, 18, violates the case filter. Mary doesn't have case. Now, in the past, that's been taken as what motivated raising in 16 up there. But we do not have that option. We could complicate the interpretive system to impose the case filter in some fashion. But apart from being unwanted conceptually, that complication, when you work it out, raises a variety of ordering problems. So suppose we adhere to the simplest option, just add nothing new. Then ask ourselves, why is 18 marked star? What's wrong with it? It raises no semantic problem. If it were acceptable, it would have a perfectly fine meaning, basically the same meaning as John tried hard for Mary to win. No case filter violation. This observation generalizes. Case does not enter into semantic interpretation. So suppose it's part of externalization, never reaches the interpretive system. Then no problems arise for our immediate purposes, and doesn't really matter which of the several varieties of case theory, which of them turns out to be the correct one. Well, we might ask why languages have case systems altogether. There doesn't seem to be any semantic reason. Maybe that establishing relations among elements facilitates perception and parsing, which would be a natural externalization issue. Well, Idan Landau has raised some interesting problems for Hornstein's analysis based on what he calls partial control. So take the examples 19. John arranged to meet at noon. That means we are going to meet at noon. If you have a pro system, the pro basically says us, not John. If you have a Hornstein-style trace system, it doesn't work because it has to be singular. So that's what Landau calls partial control. Compare John managed to meet at noon. There you can't have it. These two verbs are very similar in meaning, but only arrange allows the partial interpretation. Well, now take a look at these. John arranged or managed for us to meet at noon. John arranged or managed for them to meet at noon. They're both fine. But the sentences of 19 have the sense of 20A, not the sense of 20B. And in fact, the manage cases are pretty awkward. So the simplest assumption seems to be that 19 derives from 20A by deletion of for us, something that happens in other circumstances. There are lexical idiosyncrasies, arrange versus manage, but the basic structure remains intact. No need to change the notion of copy, no special notion of partial control. Well, let's turn finally to raising to object, which ought to work the same way if everything is in order. So let's try that for the last case. That's cases like John expected Bill to leave, John persuaded Bill to leave. These should be analogous to 14, subject raising, and 16, subject control, respectively. So in 14, in 21A, Bill raises by internal merge to the specifier of expect. Okay, that's normal object raising. In 21B, however, Bill is merged with persuade by external merge as its direct object. Now, in our highly restricted framework, the both both of these structures should have the structure in 22, both persuade and expect. In both cases, persuade and expect, the two occurrences of Bill are copies. If V in 22 is expect, the lower copy was formed by internal merge. If V is persuade, the lower copy was formed by free choice of copy. The interpretation just sees the configuration. The lower copy deletes. It's not marked undeletable in the usual fashion, all exactly the same as 14 and 16. Notice that the approach, the analysis of persuade, resurrects an approach to double complement constructions in Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory back in 1955. Now it resurrects it in a more restricted framework. In the LSLT analysis, a transformation was used to form the verbal complex persuade to leave, which has the object Bill. In our analysis, to leave, in fact, for Bill to leave, is the complement of persuade, and Bill is the object of the verbal complex persuade Bill to leave. Basically the same analysis, but now in a far more restricted framework. Well, it may be that double complement constructions generally fall into this framework, something worth looking at. Well, if all of this works, then the interpretive system can keep to the simplest Markovian assumption. We can also eliminate control theory and the element. I'm going to try to get back if I can. I can't. Okay, I'm sorry, but I'll have to stay without you seeing my, oh, wait a minute. No, I can't do it. Got there for a minute, but then it went away. I want to get back to the full screen.
Sandy, can you help us?
Okay, wait a minute. Maybe we got it.
Oh, yeah.
There we are. Okay, back. No more examples. If this works, then the interpretive system can keep to the simplest Markovian assumptions. We can also eliminate control theory. We can eliminate the element pro, capture Hornstein's basic intuition, but without violating theta theory and duality of semantics. So basically that's the best of all worlds. Notice that throughout this discussion, I haven't used the interface level, conceptual intentional interface. That hasn't been mentioned. And it's not needed. At any point in the derivation, the interpretive system can apply to a phase that has been constructed that will yield the information needed by other cognitive systems who access the thought. We can say the same about the sensory motor interface. At any point in externalization, the sensory motor system can access the derivation and take it as instructions for whatever the sensory motor systems is, articulatory gestures or whatever. So it may be then that the conceptual, intentional, and sensory motor systems are dispensable. They can be eliminated just as D and S structure were eliminated. All that remains is generation and access by language external systems. Well, other complexities and assumptions, some of them hidden, have also been eliminated, along with apparent paradoxes, contradictions, structures that simply were unformulable. The domain of genuine explanation has been extended. How far the process can concede, we cannot know, just as you can never know in the more advanced sciences. The closer we can approach the strong minimalist thesis, the better we will have addressed the Galilean challenge, the better we will have approached an understanding of the extraordinary fact that thanks to many evolutionary accidents at the latest instant of life on Earth, thought has emerged for the first time, along with its vehicle, the remarkable possession of language by one of the products of evolution. Thanks. Stop there.
Yes, thank you very much. And without taking any break, can we proceed to the just short discussion period? Professor Chomsky, is this okay with you?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, then how about Sandy Way, just a small question. And we have to finish this session up to, let's say 25, 12:25.
Okay.
10 minutes more.
Okay.
Okay. After that, we will have an announcement from the LSJ. Okay. So Sandy Way, please.
Okay, thank you. I want to go back to something you talked about during the first half of your lecture. We assume recursive merge is a species-specific property key to unlocking the language of thought, and is part of what separates us from the rest of the evolutionary tree of life. So I have a question about the external systems that interface to the language faculty. We assume that evolution need not proceed in lockstep. You've already mentioned in the first half of your lecture the fact that the resource or capacity of different subsystems in our interconnected biological system may have mismatches. So, in terms of the bandwidth required. But on the thought side, one other property you've sometimes mentioned is that we're not necessarily grounded through our sensory apparatus only, unlike perhaps the rest of the animal kingdom. So despite the fact we can't process, name, or track everything we see or hear, the ability to have abstract thought or concepts is also cited as a species-specific property. So I'm wondering, is the capacity of abstract thought a property that's directly related to merge, or did it evolve independently? Perhaps it emerged earlier or later. What do you think?
I think we're getting here into a mystery that is unsolvable. You may remember Richard Lewontin's famous paper on why there's never going to be any progress in the study of evolution of cognition. He a little bit overstated the case, can make some progress. But his point was that there are simply things that happened in the past that we have no access to. None of our methods in evolutionary science, population genetics, archaeological evidence, none of them give us any information about how people were making noises to each other, if that's what they were doing 200,000 years ago. We're stuck. In principle, it's something accessible to science. Something like, say, the source of voluntary action, creative aspect of language use, that may literally be inaccessible. It may just be that our form of intelligence can't deal with that problem. There aren't even any bad ideas about it. It's just unsolvable, unformulable. You can state the problem, can't say anything about it. But the source of concepts, theoretically, if you were a different creature who could go back in time, you could find out about it. You could go back and find out how the different stages of proto-humans, what were they saying, what were they doing, and so on. It's a huge problem. None of these concepts have any analog in the animal world. So comparative evidence is 0. Furthermore, it's not just abstract concepts, something like justice or fairness or wealth or something like that. Even the simplest words that we use to refer to things in the outside world, even those have no counterpart in the animal world. It's a long story and there's literature on it, but there is a doctrine widely held that words have reference. And that's the fundamental of what's called semantics. You study the reference of words. Now, semantics was developed for formal systems where there's a reference to a word because you say so. You pick a symbol and you say, this refers to that. You're doing meta-mathematics, say, you're studying formal mathematics, you say, the numeral 3 refers to the object 3, wherever that is, maybe some Platonistic universe. So you just stipulate that there's reference. But language is an organic system. You can't stipulate anything. It's a question of fact, whether the word river, the earliest case to be studied 2,500 years ago by the pre-Socratics, it's a question of fact whether that word refers to something. So Heraclitus famously asked, how can we cross the same river twice? It's a different physical object. How can we cross it twice? Well, when I go to work, I cross the Relito River one way and back. That's an interesting river. Doesn't have any water in it, but it is the Relito River. Whatever the concept river is, doesn't require that there be water in it. In fact, if it did have water and walls were put up along the side and it was used for freighters, it wouldn't be a river. It would be a canal. If the surface was flattened and a line was was drawn down the middle and you used to commute, it would be a highway. Point is, I won't go through the details, but minuscule changes in that physical object and it would still be a river. On the other hand, very trivial changes make it not a river anymore. You could reverse the flow, it could be dry, it could be have a different source, it would still be a river. But make a trivial change, like what I've described, it's not a river at all. So the point is that the concept river doesn't refer to anything. It's a mentally constructed concept, which we use to refer to things. The mental concept gives us a kind of perspective as to how to talk about the world. So it's not the building behind you. That's something else. Although we look at that one, we'll find the same thing. I'm assuming it's a building, but maybe not. Maybe it's a decoration or something like that. What something is depends on the design of the creators, the characteristic use, all sorts of other things that a physicist couldn't find by just looking at the external world. So we have a real problem here, not just abstract words, but even the simplest, most elementary words in the language, those that we use to relate the language to the outside world. Even those have no counterpart. In animal communication systems, every symbol is one-to-one associated with some physically identifiable phenomenon. So a vervet monkey makes what we call a warning call because the leaves are moving. Maybe there's an eagle up there. That's the way we interpret it. I don't know what the monkeys say, but they just run for cover when this comes. That's how all animal communication systems work, even the most complex ones like the bee communication system. It's all one associated with mind-independent objects. Language is just not true at all. Well, as I say, if we were time travelers, could go back a couple 100,000 years, we might learn something about where all this is coming from. But as Dick Lewontin pointed out, we're stuck, can't do it. So as he put it at the end of his article, tough luck. You're not going to find anything about the evolution of these things. We're too limited. So it's a big problem, but unless somebody can figure out some other way of studying it beyond this.
Thank you.
Okay, then in completing Professor Chomsky's invited lecture, I would like to thank Professor Chomsky for his kindness, and as you know, we should also thank
My dog
Ms.
really got
Valeria
happy.
Chomsky for her help is enormous, as you see. Okay, thank you very much for everything. And we will have an announcement anyway. Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky.
Okay. See you soon.
See you
I'll give
soon.
your regards to your Japanese maple.
Okay. Thank you for